Hello, tea friends. In honor of the Taiwan Tea Festival, we thought we would record a little mini course on the history of bowl tea. It will be divided into 3 parts. This first part we're going to publish onto YouTube, and then on the course website for free, we will upload all 3 videos. So if you watch this first video and you're interested in watching the following 2, you just head over to our course website, which will be linked below, and you can watch the whole course for free. The course will be all about the history of bowl tea. In this first video, I'm going to talk about kind of tea culture in general and some of my thoughts on modern tea culture. Then in the second video, we're going to dive deep into dynastic and ancient history and talk about bowl tea as it extends back in time, and a lot of the history and interesting facts and how it got to where we are today. And then in the final video, we're going to talk about the modern era, and in particular Taiwan, where bowl tea thrives in the way that we practice it. So all the different types of bowl tea that made their way to Taiwan and how they were innovated and adapted and changed in the modern era of the last 100 years. So these are the 3 videos that will make up this little mini course. I hope you enjoy them and that they're informative and help to inspire you to prepare bowl tea if you never have, or deepen your understanding of a bowl tea practice if you already have one. So in this first video, I want to just talk about modern tea culture and explain a little bit about why some of you perhaps have never encountered bowl tea. Because it is a rarer brewing method in the modern world. And so in order to do that, I'm just going to discuss some of the facets of tea culture in general that make this so. I think there are 2 reasons why studying tea in the modern era can be challenging, or at least why it was challenging for me. And I think both are relevant to this discussion. I think the first is that a lot of tea is passed on orally. There's just so much tea information and wisdom that is handed down over tea tables, orally. And so there's then first the language barrier. If you don't speak Chinese or Japanese or Korean or all 3. And I highly suggest learning. Especially Chinese is such a beautiful language and has brought so much to my life to study it to the limited extent that I have. I still have work to do in that area, but the more of it I understand, the more it improves my life and understanding of all things tea. But even once you cross that language barrier, there's still the fact that a lot of it is just not preserved in scholarship in the form of books or other things. And what is preserved in books, only a very small fraction is translated. So back to that language barrier. You know, when I was in university, I got all these Chinese books on tea, and I had them translated by local engineering students that were Chinese exchange students for a very affordable price. I don't remember what it was, $50. And it came back, of course, kind of like Google Translate in its early days. Because, you know, for $50 they worked on it to the extent that one would. And then I found out a lot of the books didn't even have valuable information, and I poured through that broken English to learn things, and there really was so much kind of I could see that was leading off in other directions that I had yet to explore. I could see all these roads, all these ways of understanding and things about tea processing, tea history, tea brewing, everything that I had yet to explore. And it alerted me to how big this world is. And so at that time I was already a writer, and I kind of, in the back of my mind, on the back burner, I had this idea that somebody should do something about this. There should be more English scholarship in the world. And years later, that resulted in Global Tea Up magazine, and we have translated so many hundreds and hundreds of articles. We have many issues that are the largest English publication on that topic. And that was all born of that vow in the early 90s when I was in college. And it's still inexhaustible. In fact, as the editor-in-chief, I often have to read the magazines like 4 or 5 times, and I don't want that to be a chore. So I often choose topics that relate to things that I have yet to study, that are new to me. So that as I read the magazine over and over again, I'm actually learning, and then I'm excited to do my job, so it doesn't become boring. And even after all these years, more than 100 issues of Global Tea, I have yet to exhaust or come anywhere near exhausting the topics that are available to learn about. There's just so much. I'm still a beginner, 30 years plus in. So there is just so much, even in terms of scholarship. But then it becomes really vast because you realize that so much of it's oral and extends beyond what can be studied in articles or books or magazines. There's just so much that's handed down orally that I only learned because I was able to speak with tea teachers who know so much more than me and hand down their experience and wisdom and other things that are just not written about. There's so much that can't be written about, and there's so much that isn't written about. It makes it really challenging to study tea because it's so oral. And I think that the second big barrier to learning about tea, which even more directly relates to why perhaps some of you have never encountered bowl tea, and that is diversity. Diversity. The diversity of the tea world is just as vast as the amount of information, both in terms of scholarship and writing, and that which is oral and extends beyond what you can read in books or articles, even if you learn Chinese. The diversity is bigger. It's a bigger issue. And this is an issue that actually context and distance matters. It really does. If you're on the earth and you look up at the sky at night and you point and say, that's the moon, that makes perfect sense as a category. But if you're on the moon, then moon is meaningless. You'll be then discussing that ridge over there, that crater, that ravine, the dark side, the bright side. You'll be using a whole new context to map your terrain. Similarly, if you're on a hill or you're looking at a map of a forest, the name of that forest, let's say Binbo from Lord of the Rings, right? That makes perfect sense. But if you're in that forest, then the name of the forest is meaningless. And it's all about that creek and that path and that grove and that meadow, etc. What does this have to do with tea? A lot, actually, because if you live in a city in Europe or America, let's say you're in New York, and you call your friend up on the phone and you say, hey, let's go out for Chinese food tonight. That makes perfect sense to them. That comment makes perfect sense. And they may even know exactly which restaurant you're talking about. But where I live, if I called somebody and said, let's go out for Chinese food, that would be meaningless. That wouldn't mean anything here. Because the food from Yunnan province is completely different from Sichuan, and those are neighboring provinces. There are so many types of Chinese food. And unless it's a Western restaurant, all the food here is Chinese. So that's too vague of a term to be of any use here. And so what can happen, I think, also in the West is that from that distance you can say, oh, this is what Chinese tea culture is. And unfortunately, there are people also who are trying to moderate that conversation about what it is or what pure tea culture is or correct tea culture. But here in Taiwan, the diversity is immense. When you include China, then it just becomes huge, global. It's just giant. There are people here who approach tea from a scientific perspective and want to study the biology and chemistry. There are those who practice it spiritually and view it as a type of cultivation. Most all the monasteries and nunneries in Taiwan have tea ceremonies that they use as part of their weekly practice schedule. And there are other more spiritual or esoteric approaches to tea. There are those who wear blue jeans and t-shirts and those who have tea clothes. There are people who brew tea very casually and pour fluidly and loosely. And then there are schools where you have to bring a measuring tape to class. because your tea utensil has to be exactly 2 centimeters from your tea boat, and you have to pick it up exactly, precisely in the right way, and you're tested. There are schools like that. In Taipei is a very famous one with hundreds of students. So there are very strict ceremonial forms and approaches to tea, and there are those who brew very, very casually and loosely and freely. There are all different kinds of wares. There are those who use bowls, and they will speak about all the benefits of using a bowl. We have some interviews from the Bowl Tea Festival where some of the teachers of bowl tea discuss why using a bowl is better. And we'll get into that a little bit in the history too. And then there are those who brew gongfu and say, no, it must be in the Yixing pot. That's what makes the best tea. And so on and so on and so on. The diversity is vast. And so standing on the other side of the world and speaking about Chinese tea culture as though it's this monolithic thing, or worse yet, as though there's some pure or authentic version of it, is a little bit unrealistic, because here it is so vast. And there are forums and magazines and all kinds of online discussion groups where thousands of tea scholars are arguing and have been arguing for centuries about the meaning of the exact same thing and what it is. And so all of that diversity can be a real challenge to studying tea, because once you cross that language barrier and once you start getting some of that oral information, you're gonna encounter like what, at least at the outset, appears to be fundamentally contradictory information. This person's going to say, no, this. This person's going to say, no, this, right? Recently, a brother of mine came here from Malaysia, and we went to visit some of his old tea friends in Taiwan, and he had a single question he wanted to ask them, because it's something that Taiwanese tea people have more experience with than Malaysian tea people. And so all 4 of the people we visited, he asked them this question, and he got 4 completely different answers, 2 of which were contradictory. And he left a little bit confused, because this diversity is so vast and so big in terms of teaware, brewing methods, approaches to tea. In fact, I know several Taiwanese people who are also potters and tea people, Chajin. And these Chajin, they have created their own wares and their own brewing method, such that the only place on earth you can encounter that brewing method is at their house. So it's a one of one. And there are several of those. So there's constant innovation as well. Taiwan in particular is one of the most creative places on earth. It has a really high per capita of artists. And so here there are so many musicians, artists, painters, and ceramicists. Taiwanese love ceramics. We'll talk about that in part 3 of this series. So there's tremendous innovation, and there's a lot of different types of brewing. One of Taiwan's most famous tea people, we call him He Lao, Master He. He is been kind of at the center of a lot of Taiwanese culture since the Taiwan tea culture boom in the 1970s, which we'll discuss in part 3. And he wrote an article recently. We translated it in the summer, I think 24 issue. It has his article. We translated in it. And it's all about tea spaces. And in there, he makes a really important point related to everything that I'm talking about. He says that if you consider someone a tea person that brews tea every day, that drinks tea every day that they prepare, if that's the criteria of what a tea person is, then he estimates about 2 of the 10 million people who live in Taipei are tea people. 1/5, roughly, of the people in Taipei are tea people. And so what he said was, therefore, if you come to Taiwan and you visit all the most famous public tea spaces, you're as crazy about tea as I am, and you want to see it all. So you come here and you take, 2-3 weeks, and you just go to every public tea house, every tea shop. You visit everything that's open to the public, and you drink tea there. You will still only have encountered about 1% of the tea that is happening in Taipei on that day. For example, I know of a tea session that's been going on every morning for like more than 30 years that's up in the mountains behind this apartment complex near Xinyi. And it's these old guys who sit around there's all these gazebos and tea spaces all over Taiwan in the mountains. You travel in the mountains in Taiwan, you go a few kilometers, you're going to come across these public like gazebos or tables with chairs for eating or picnicking or drinking tea. And these old guys have been drinking tea there for like 30 years, the same guys every morning. That's a tea session that's not public, right? And then, as I mentioned, and some of you experienced who came on our Global Tea Hut trip, if you go to the nunneries or the monasteries, they have bowl tea ceremonies. Usually it's bowl tea, sometimes it's gongfu, but they have ceremonial forms that are related to their meditation practice that they're doing every week. So that is another whole type of tea that's very different than what you can encounter in shops and etc. The variations between shops might be less, but once you include all of the tea people in Taiwan, north and south and middle, it becomes a vast ocean of very big differences. Very big differences. And that diversity explains why some of you maybe have not encountered Taiwan bowl tea culture, though it's there, and why also studying tea can be difficult. So I think the fact that a lot is passed down orally and the language barrier, which I would include in that, so that even the scholarship of what isn't passed down orally, what is in records, historical records, and articles, if you can't read Chinese, becomes a barrier unless someone translates it. We're trying to do that, but even if we spend our whole life translating, we can't even come close to translating the amount of articles that have been donated to Global Tea Hut, because we have 3 or 4 friends that have donated the complete body of their work to us to translate. We can use anything we want. And even if we translate the rest of our lives and we live another 50 years, hopefully, we won't be able to come close to all of it. So without the language, you can't even access what is written down. And then beyond that is a whole bunch more that is oral. And then the second issue is that of that oral stuff, of that written stuff, there's a lot of diversity. And it can contradict itself. And that brings me to my final point or observation that I'd like to discuss with regards to tea culture and approaching tea culture, especially as a Western person, but even as a beginner here in Asia. If you are Chinese and you do speak Chinese, you're going to encounter the difficulties of that things are oral and that things are diverse. You're going to encounter them all the same. At the end, I'll give a little bit of advice for that, but the last kind of main point that I want to discuss is the approach that some people have towards tea, where their approach is there is no right or wrong way to prepare tea. I like the sentiment of this idea because it's built on tolerance, which is a paramita, a perfection in Buddhism. So, of course, I appreciate the tolerance that inspires such a statement. There is no right or wrong way to make tea. And from a kind of meta level, I even agree. But within that statement, there's some stickiness. There's what we in philosophy call a performative contradiction. A performative contradiction is something that basically sounds cool in thought. Philosophically, it is valuable. But then when you go to try to do it or live it, it becomes contradictory. It's ironic or hypocritical. It doesn't work. In this case, we have a sticky performative contradiction, because if I say there is no right or wrong way to make tea, I have just created a right and wrong way to make tea, because I am saying that those who practice without right or wrong are practicing right, and those who have a right and wrong are wrong. And so I'm doing the very thing that I set out to avoid through tolerance. This is a problem because, as I mentioned, there are schools that prepare tea very casually, very freely, very loosely. They practice a loose, casual style of tea, and there are those that have very, very strict forms. But in Chinese philosophy, right, we have yin and yang, and within every yin is a yin and yang, and within every yang is a yin and yang, and that goes on infinitely in a fractal, because they are relative. So actually, these differences aren't as big as one would first assume. Because on this side, you have a tea person who says that there should be no right and wrong way to make tea. You just make tea the way your heart feels. I agree. When people ask me what's the right way to make tea, I always say with your heart. If you're using your heart, you're doing it right. But if you watch that person prepare tea, I guarantee they have a pattern. They aren't the first steeping pouring like this, and the second steeping switching hands and pouring like this, and moving everything around or doing it behind their back. There's a pattern. If that person who says that there's no right and wrong way to make tea, you do it very loosely and casually, if you follow them for a week and watch them brew tea, you will see they follow a pattern. They have a form. It might not be articulated, but it's there. And on the other side, those schools who practice some strict ceremonial form, the idea is that you practice the form over and over again until it becomes muscle memory, second nature. And you can do it without thinking about it. That's what we call wu wei, free. Right? Both of these are wu wei. So the goal in both sides is really the same. This side, even though it's strict, has freedom. And this side, even though it's free, it has form. And within it, there are degrees. There are people who are very casual, and there are people who are less so. And over here, for example, in that side of having ceremonial form, what's called shouqian in Chinese, teme in Japanese. My Japanese pronunciation is poor, I'm sorry for that. There are very strict schools where you got to bring a ruler to class and measure everything. And then there are schools where the form is there, but it's a little bit more loose. So within that is yin and yang. In fact, our tradition, our way of making tea, we have a form in bowl tea, not in gongfu tea, but in bowl tea. And we're on the looser side. If you look at all of those who have shouqian, who have some ceremonial form, we're a little bit looser. We're a little bit more yin in that yang. So there's a big range of all these things, a big range, and they overlap. And there's this one in this one and this one in this one. So if you go up one step and then you repeat your statement from a higher step, a higher vantage point, and say there's no right and wrong way to make tea. And by that you mean that you can do it casually and freely, or you can follow a ceremonial form as so many thousands and thousands of chajin around the world do. You can do either of these freely. If that's what you mean by there's no right and wrong, then I'm fully with you. But if you mean that this side is right and all those who practice this way are wrong, then I feel like that's sticky and you're going to reach a performative contradiction. Also, sometimes in a reductionistic way, these divisions are drawn along national lines. So from a very basic perspective, one could assume that Japanese tea has more form and Chinese tea is more loose. And those trends are true, but they're also stereotypes. And they do disservice to all the Japanese tea traditions that are very loose and free, and all the Chinese tea traditions that are very strict, like the school that I mentioned in Taipei, where you have to bring a tape measure and dress a certain way, and you're all tested on all of it. So there are all of these things on both sides, and the tea world is incredibly vast and diverse. So if you encounter a brewing method that you've never seen before, it could be because this world is so diverse. It could be because that method is an innovation of something that you might be more familiar with, but it's been innovated in such a way that it looks a little bit different. Because innovation is also happening all the time. All the time. So there are new ways that are arising all the time. But all the new ways that arise, whether they arose hundreds of years ago, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, or yesterday, they don't arise ex nihilo. They don't come out of nothing. They come out of older ways that come out of older ways that come out of older ways that come out of older ways, right? As we talked to the artists in the Bowl Tea Festival, many of them discussed this. Rooted in tradition, but able to innovate. I feel the same way. I'm rooted in tradition, but able to innovate. Like a tree. I have roots in the ground, taking nourishment from that which has come before, but new branches coming out, forming new things. If traditions don't innovate, these things actually are not mutually exclusive. They go together. It's one tree. Because if a tradition doesn't innovate, it will slowly die. Because it will become less and less relevant to new generations of people. It won't meet them where they are. It'll meet people where they were a long time ago. And so it has to meet people where they are to have people practice it. Or they won't be inspired to practice it because it won't bring benefit to their life. So it has to bring benefit to their life where they are, and then they'll practice it, and then it will continue, and then it will be passed down. And so that balance between tradition and innovation, it's a tough one. You could say it's a third leg of why studying tea is difficult. We talked about the fact that so much is oral. First, there's a language barrier, and then beyond the language barrier and even what you can read, there's a lot that's oral. There's diversity and contradiction everywhere. And then a third really is this. This is a third, that there is really at the center of it so much depth, so much profundity, that things are innovating all the time because it's rich soil. And that balance between innovation and tradition is potent and difficult, because especially as a beginner, we don't maybe know, and you don't know which parts to preserve, which are important and key and need to be held on to, and which can be expressed and changed and grow. That's a difficult balance. Just like the diversity. The diversity means that oftentimes we have to choose as tea people, do we want to study deeply or broadly? And the balance between deep and broad is unique to every individual. Every one of you will have to decide where you land in that balance between tradition and innovation. My suggestion would be root yourself deeply in tradition first and then innovate, because then your innovation will come out of that spirit of tradition and it will have deep nutrients. So grow deep roots that make your tree healthy and can't be blown away, and then start to branch out and innovate. But then second, you'll have to decide to study deeply or broadly. If you study too broad, you're like a jack of all trades, master of none. You don't go to the depth. The Buddha spoke about this. Digging little holes, you never get water. You just keep moving around digging little holes because you think the digging is better elsewhere, when actually the digging gets boring and rocky no matter where your hole is. And so eventually it becomes monotonous and you have to repeat things for decades, and then only do you get that depth. A lot of skills, a lot of arts, in 5 to 10 years you can master like 80-85% of them. And then you'll spend the next 50-60 years getting that last 10-15%. Little bit by bit, because it's harder to go to the depths. So do you study deeply? If you go too deep, you get narrow. You lose perspective. Sometimes it's important to travel so that you see your own culture through the eyes of other people and what they think about it. I learned a lot about America. I've been now to more than 90 countries, so you see America through the lens of other people's. It's very helpful to understand yourself. So you have a favorite type of music, and you explore other types of music. That not only expands your understanding of music in general, capital M, it also helps you to contextualize and understand the makeup of that music that you like the most. There's a good example of this in Zen. A long time ago, the Zen masters, it depended on the tradition. Sometimes it was a month, sometimes 3 months. Other types of Buddhism also have this tradition, by the way. Many Theravada schools, for example. But in Zen, they would have the students leave the monastery. They were basically kicked out for like 1 to 3 months a year. And the idea was then they would go traveling, which would teach them self-sufficiency and how to find their own way in the world. But also, more importantly, they would travel to other temples and hear other teachers talk. And maybe they would hear something new. Or maybe they would hear the same thing but spoken in a different way that unlocked it in their head. Their teacher had been saying it over and over again, but they just hear it in that new way and boop, now I understand finally, right? But then they would come back, and for the other 9 months, they would work with their teacher and go deeper. And they would discuss, obviously that teacher was open-minded and available to discuss all of those other teachings, or he or she would not have asked them to go traveling. So then they could discuss what they had learned on the road and contextualize it and land it into a daily repetitive practice. And that was a good formula for the right balance of breadth and depth. I think in the modern world, breadth is more dangerous than depth now, because there's just so much information. There's so much diversity. All that diversity in the tea world that used to be completely oral, so even if you wanted, you wouldn't encounter all of it. Now we have big festivals where it all comes together. And we have online forums and YouTube channels, and my voice in this video is just one amongst many people speaking about tea, and is adding also to that diversity of perspective, admittedly. So there is a real, you could say, danger of being way too broad and having then lots of understanding, but all of it surface, and not going deep into one thing, one tradition, one practice, one way, which I recommend, because the last thing that I'll say in this first video, the last thing I'd like to discuss, is that the more mature that I've gotten in my tea practice, the more that I've come to understand that all this diversity is not really antagonistic. When I was a beginner, I was very passionate and proud of the way that I had learned to make tea, of my teachers and my practice. I felt like this is the best way, and I was proud in all the ways that a young man can be. And I also looked at other approaches to tea and saw the contradictions, the differences. And they seemed mutually exclusive. They seemed like there was no ability to harmonize them or to reconcile them, that they were just two completely opposite approaches to the same thing. But the more mature that I've gotten, the more I've come to really see with my own eyes that the differences in all these brewing methods and approaches to tea is really just a difference of emphasis. They all have all the things that the other has. They just emphasize one thing that the others don't. So in this school or approach to tea, this is emphasized. Perhaps it's fragrance. Perhaps it's enjoyment of flavor. Or perhaps it's the social side of tea, which is beautiful. 一茶会友, through tea make friends. The whole like tea house culture, getting together, having a chat, talking about tea, that whole hospitality, social aspect of tea. Maybe there's an emphasis there. Maybe there's an emphasis on fragrance. Over here there's maybe an emphasis on mouthfeel. Or then there's an emphasis on the brewing form and the way that it helps us to establish mindfulness, and etc., etc. These are just differences in emphasis. And usually, if you show up and you're open-minded, you can learn something from a different perspective and approach. You can also see that that person who brews tea more casually still practices mindfulness. And that person who practices tea in a very mindful way still wants to be loose and relaxed. So, you know, my teacher often says relaxed but not casual. Upright but not tense. So that's almost a way of like coming right to the middle of these two things and meeting there. And so I really, the further I've gone, the more I've realized this diversity, it's all just diversity of emphasis. It's all just a placement of emphasis on certain wares, certain approaches to tea. And I would invite all of you to come here to Taiwan and hopefully come on one of our tours that we're doing annually, and you'll get to experience many different types of tea brewing and tea people in Taiwan, both tea makers and tea brewers. If you can, come to the next Taiwan Bolt Tea Festival, and you'll get to interact with all kinds of teachers who use bowl tea and also the potters who make the bowls that we use and love. This is the third one. They don't do it every year. It's like every 2 or 3 years because it's very big, it's 2 weeks long and expensive and involves lots of people coming from all different arts and culture and stuff. So they only do it every so often. This is our first time participating. The next one we will also be participating, so we hope to promote it on social media long before it happens, which would give many of you the opportunity to make some travel arrangements and maybe come and experience it with us. We'd love that. In the meantime, keep an open mind, explore, and be broad, and approach with all the approaches to tea, the different types of analysis of it, and the different brewing methods, while also hopefully finding one that resonates with you that you can go deeper into. If you'd like to learn more about the history of bowl tea, follow the link in the description if you're watching this on YouTube, and it'll take you to our course website where you can get this mini course for free. We have 2 more videos, one about the dynastic history of bowl tea, where bowl tea comes from, and then the final one about the modern era of bowl tea. And those will have lots of information to help expand your understanding of your bowl tea practice and where it comes from, or maybe to inspire you to begin one. So I hope to see you there, where we can explore this deep and vast universe in a bowl, which is the theme of this year 2025's Taiwan Bowl Tea Festival.